I'm not
It's pretty addicting.
quite sure about that, but sure. But
Yeah, Brendan's got it. Brendan gave me a run for my money last spring in the fantasy birding league, but sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's 6:06, so I think you're good to go. We are recording, and I'll probably just post this to YouTube, and so that way other people can watch it if they want. So
Cool.
yeah, let me see if I can. All right. Oh, there we go. You should be good to go.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
See the slides? All right. Cool. Well, thank you all very much for inviting me to give a talk about birds today. My name is Paul Dougherty. I am a fourth year PhD student now here at UW in the Department of Zoology. I work with Matt Carling. And I realized that my placement of my title on the slide may have been not very strategic, because maybe for you guys it's blocked by the I don't know, the cameras. But if you can't see it, my talk is called "Why I Spent All Day Thinking About Birds." So I was told to just give a little bit of background about how I ended up at UW. So I won't give you my entire life story, but just as a, kind of in a nutshell, I grew up in Eastern Massachusetts, not too far from Boston. And I consider myself incredibly lucky because when I grew up, even though I lived in a fairly suburban, urban setting, I still had plenty of opportunities to explore the natural world. This was a place where I'd go to a lot as a kid, um, and develop an appreciation for natural history. And most importantly, it gave me a chance to fall in love with birds. And maybe some of you who have taken ornithology before recognize some of these species, although most of them are things that you can see in the Northeast and not so much in Wyoming, but these are all birds that hold a very special place in my memory. And eventually I went to college at a small liberal arts school in central Maine called Colby College. I majored in biology, also classics. I was on the rowing team. Maybe you guys can't see that, but that's a picture of me rowing in college. And I was also really lucky because after my sophomore year of undergrad, I had the opportunity to spend a summer working for the National Audubon Society's seabird restoration program in the Gulf of Maine. So we were doing a lot of work to maintain breeding habitat and setting out decoys for social attraction for a lot of, I don't know, I think really iconic and awesome seabirds that breed in the Gulf of Maine, like Atlantic puffins and common and Arctic terns. I like the terns a lot, especially. Um, so, we'd spend all summer working on these islands, mostly getting attacked and pooped on by terns a lot. I'm not in this photo, but that is a picture of me, which maybe, again, you can't see because of the Zoom screens, but that's a picture of me holding a baby common guillemot, which is a species closely related to puffins. And I think back very fondly about this experience quite a bit, because it was when I really realized that while I had been interested in birds for pretty much all of my life, it was this job that made me realize that I really enjoyed working with them in a professional context. And I might want to make this more of a hobby, more than just a hobby, I guess. Um, but I think probably the most important or influential thing in terms of my future trajectory that I did in undergrad was I for whatever reason, made the made a smart decision to get involved in undergraduate research. Later on, I guess I didn't really start doing this until my senior year, but I had the opportunity to work with a professor, and I did an independent research project looking at winter finch patterns in winter finch migration. So I guess as I was learning more and more about birds, I was becoming more interested in migration, and I think these finches are birds that have always been, well, I guess were birds that I had discovered were incredibly interesting, because these high latitude finch species like common redpolls, which is what this range map is showing, but also others like pine grosbeak, purple finch, and pine siskin, do this really cool thing where they breed in tundra and I guess areas just south of tundra habitat in Alaska and northern Canada. And amazingly, if there's enough food to sustain these birds year round, they're actually able to overwinter in these incredibly high latitudes in the tundra, where there's very little daylight. It's incredibly cold, but as long as there's enough food, they can eke out a living over the winter. But because the seed crops in these northern latitudes are really cyclical, there's lots of trees with these like cyclical masting cycles, and which means that every few years you have a total failure of seed crops. And that's when you have these huge invasions of these northern finches into southern latitudes. So, you can have common redpolls, which breed in the northernmost part of Canada, wandering as far south as like Nevada or California, which I think is really cool how just facultative, I guess, and irregular they are in their migration. So, and here's a figure showing Christmas bird count records of common redpolls in Maine. And you can see that some winters they're not in Maine at all, which is when they're spending the entire year in northern latitudes, but some winters they're very common because you have these big numbers invading south. So what I did for my senior year of undergrad is I spent a lot of time learning R and analyzing data from 2 citizen science databases, which I really enjoyed doing because I spent a lot of time contributing to those databases myself, the Christmas bird count and eBird, which are 2 of my favorite things ever. And we actually found this really interesting pattern where in years where you have big invasions of northern finches, finches that breed farther south, like American goldfinches, are less common in those winters. And it could be that they're also moving south. So you have this really neat alternating pattern in the abundance of northern finches and southern finches. But really the point that I want to make by talking about that is even though, I don't know, I think that research is not the most impactful, and we did eventually get it published, me and my undergraduate advisor we got it published in a very low impact journal, but I'm still really, really proud of this study for lots of reasons, mostly because it was pretty hard for me to do because, when I started, I didn't know anything about R. Back then, it was a lot less common to teach R in undergraduate classes. And I also learned a lot about working with large data sets. So I learned a lot, and I also think that doing this study was probably the most important thing I did as an undergrad in terms of getting accepted into a graduate program. I guess it sort of, demonstrated that I could do a big research project mostly on my own. So it turned out to be a really important thing in the trajectory of my life, even though I didn't really know that it would be at the time. Um, and after I finished undergrad, um, I spent a few years, or I guess, yeah, I spent 1 year in between um, when I graduated college and starting grad school, where I did a bunch of different things. I had a few different field jobs. There I am holding a Merlin. I also had one where we were doing surveys for this really awesome bird called an American woodcock. I did some work with this species, which is called a golden-winged warbler. And in my mind, the most interesting thing about this species is it hybridizes a ton with a closely related species called the blue-winged warbler to make birds like this. And I also did a few other random things that year. Like I was a Latin tutor and like a cross-country ski coach. It was an interesting year. Yeah, I don't know, kind of like a fun time in between undergrad and your graduate program. And I also think that there was a lot of value in spending at least 1 year after finishing undergrad to think about what exactly I wanted to do in grad school, because whether if you are interested in going to grad school someday, be it for a master's or a PhD, either way, it's a very big commitment, and you want to make sure that you are doing something that you're really, really interested in, and are really enthusiastic about contributing knowledge to. So I did a lot of thinking this year, and then sort of later in my undergrad, and I was thinking that like my experiences in the field and doing my undergraduate research project, and honestly, most importantly, my just life experience spending a lot of time birding, made me realize that the questions that I'm most interested in have to do with speciation, studying how new species arise, how they maintain or how they continue to be reproductively isolated from each other, what their evolutionary future holds, and the evolutionary relationships among these lineages. It's really just all the forces that explain the wonderful bird diversity that we enjoy today. So I eventually came to the University of Wyoming because I somehow managed to convince this guy that I would be a good addition to his lab. That's Matt Carling, my advisor, who's sporting a really awesome mustache right now. I had a mustache a few weeks ago, but I got rid of it because I think it was weird that Matt and I both had mustaches. And one thing that I guess the main focus of research in the Carling lab is looking at hybridization, I guess, sort of studying speciation through the lens of these hybrid systems. And as a quick review, we often think about hybridization after secondary contact. So you can see in this figure, you have this ancestral population that gets split into two different daughter populations by a geographic barrier, the model of allopatric speciation. And sometimes when this geographic barrier goes away, these two lineages come into secondary contact. And if the mechanisms of pre-zygotic reproductive isolation are weak enough, these two lineages somehow still recognize each other as potential mates. There's potential for hybridization. There's lots of reasons why I've come to appreciate hybridization as this really awesome phenomenon. One is that hybridization or hybrid systems are often seen as like these super colliders of speciation. And what that means is if you look at hybrid zones and things that are going wrong with hybrids, you can see or you can appreciate the exact traits or features of the genome or the exact processes that are driving isolation and divergence between the hybridizing species. So here's an example that I think is pretty fun. So chickadees hybridize quite a bit. Mostly in the east, there's black-capped chickadees hybridizing with Carolina chickadees. And also around where we are, you can have black-capped chickadees hybridizing with mountain chickadees. So this is a probably hybrid chickadee that I saw near Casper a few years ago. You can see it looks kind of intermediate between a black-capped and mountain chickadee. If, you know, some of you think back to your ornithology class. But one thing that seems to be going on with the chickadees is because of weird things that happen, I guess, just mismatch between the genomes of the two parental species. When they come together in a hybrid, certain parts of their brain don't develop properly. So they can have really, they end up having, like very poorly formed, like a hippocampus and certain other parts of the brain, which means that they're stupid, I guess, compared to unmixed chickadees. And they also have really bad memories, which is bad if you're a chickadee because chickadees don't migrate. Instead, they survive winters by caching seeds and remembering where they hid those seeds. And if you can't remember where you hid those seeds, you're probably not going to make it through the winter. So, one mechanism of selection against hybrids. Another reason why hybrid systems are super cool is that they're sort of like a really important crossroads, I guess, on the evolutionary destiny, I guess, of a lineage. I at least that's the way I think of it. So if you have two lineages that start to hybridize, you can have a bunch of different things that can happen. You can have those two lineages homogenize, or you could have them diverge from each other eventually and stop hybridizing if hybrids are bad, or you could have them continually hybridize with each other. And we now think that if you look across the tree of life, there are lots of examples where hybridization between different lineages has caused really big explosions in biodiversity. So one example, it's maybe the only non-bird example I have in this talk, are these cichlids in Africa, which are really, really diverse. And we think that the reason why they're so diverse is because there was hybridization early in their evolutionary history, which caused sort of the appearance of new phenotypic combinations much more rapidly than you'd get just by like mutations in a single lineage alone. So hybridization can have a really important role in the evolutionary history of a lineage. And I guess I won't talk about this because I want to save some time. But anyway, I guess the systems that we study in the Carling lab are a bunch of hybrid zones that occur in pretty much the same place in the Great Plains of North America. So you have this replicate pattern in not just birds, but also plants, mammals, a bunch of different taxa where you have eastern and western species that are closely related that were isolated from each other during the Pliocene and Pleistocene by glaciers. But now that the glaciers have retreated, these eastern and western lineages have expanded north and now come into contact and often hybridize with each other in the Great Plains. So again, maybe some of you recognize some of these birds, but in the Great Plains, we have Bullock's orioles hybridizing with Baltimore orioles, indigo buntings hybridizing with lazuli buntings, spotted towhees hybridizing with eastern towhees, and a bunch of other examples. Although in the Carling lab, our favorite system are the buntings, indigo bunting from Eastern North America and Lashley bunting from Western North America. But before I go into why, or like the cool things that we can look at with this hybrid zone, I just wanted to spend some time to talk about the importance of natural history in research. So I talked a little bit earlier how I really value natural history, and I think that it should have a really important place in informing, I guess, yeah, inspiring research, I guess, in a lot of fields. And I feel particularly strongly about that because in my system, the indigo buntings and Lashley buntings, there's this really awesome natural history observation that we only know about from some fantastic naturalists studying these populations in the wild, and also looking at, you know, museum specimens and things like that. That I think has really opened up so many more meaningful questions, meaningful and important questions in the system that I guess we wouldn't really know to ask if there wasn't a really strong, I don't know, lots of people interested in natural history, or lots of people interested in you know, valuing natural history for birds especially. But yeah, like this observation that I'm talking about is that birds from Eastern North America and birds from Western North America are totally different from each other because they molt and migrate differently. So what I mean by that is species like indigo bunting, which breed in Eastern North America, do their molt, where they replace all of their feathers, which is something that birds have to do every single year because they need their feathers to fly. And also feathers wear away every year. You know, they get eaten by parasites, they get worn down by the sun and vegetation. So if you don't replace your feathers every year, you know, you probably aren't going to survive the next year. And after Eastern species molt on their breeding grounds, that's when they migrate down to their wintering grounds, and then they repeat the whole thing. But Western species, birds that breed in Western North America, like Lashley bunting as an example, live in totally different conditions. And because it gets so dry in Western North America in late summer, as soon as these species finish breeding, they hightail it down to areas of Mexico, where there is a huge productivity boom induced by the North American monsoon. You know, who knew? But we have a monsoon that hits Western Mexico and quite a bit actually into the southwestern United States every single fall. And these species migrate down to those monsoonal areas to take advantage of that productivity because their breeding grounds are too dry. And once they finish molting, then they continue on a little farther to the winter grounds, and then, you know, return to their breeding grounds. So just these very different life history strategies that are repeated across, you know, a lot of Eastern and Western birds, I guess. And I think that's a really, really interesting divide, I guess, that is something that we only know about from amazing natural historians, and has lots of really important implications for the evolutionary history of these birds, and also their future conservation and future evolution as well. So just really quick, I want to talk a bit about my research, kind of the questions that I ask and the approaches that I use to address them. So I'm really interested in seeing, or for part of my dissertation, seeing how this dramatic life history difference between Eastern birds and Western birds manifests in hybrids, and yeah, I guess how it sort of maybe selects against hybrids or doesn't select against hybrids. So I focus on indigo buntings and Lashley buntings, which is super lucky because they are, I think, the most beautiful birds in all of North America. indigo bunting on the right, lazuli bunting on the left. And here's a bunch of hybrids. You can see that these birds look kind of intermediate between indigo buntings and lazuli buntings. And what we do is we catch a lot of these birds from the hybrid zone. Have had some really awesome help from some undergrads at UW helping me, some really awesome undergrads here at UW help me make sure that I can catch enough birds and achieve this goal. And wasn't able to go out this past summer, but we're hoping to replicate this study again in this upcoming summer. So, if you're interested in getting involved in this study, let me know. There's some, pretty, you don't think of, or I don't know, I'm sorry if anybody is from Nebraska, but when I first decided that I was going to do some field work in Nebraska, I never thought that it would be, very nice, but it turns out that it was really pretty. There are lots of cool things in Nebraska other than the buntings, just some, habitat photos. And for this study, we actually bring these birds into captivity and we observe their molts. And I hope this video works, but we also look at their migratory behavior. So they're nocturnal migrants. I don't know if you guys can see this. Maybe, hopefully it's not too laggy, but it's basically showing that at night, these birds are showing migratory behavior where they hop around and flap their wings and have their bills pointed upwards. You can see that bird on the right and now the bird on the left are flapping their wings and showing typical migratory behavior. I don't know, hope you guys could see that. Maybe it shows up on the YouTube video or whatever. And so far we found some really interesting differences between the two species. So we do confirm that there are, indigo buntings, which is, the representative of the eastern species, molt first. Molt first and migrate later. And what we've shown for the first time is that some hybrids do some really weird things. Like this was one hybrid that started molting, then stopped molting, and then started showing migratory behavior, and then started molting again. So this bird molted both before and after migrating, which is just a very weird thing for a bird to do, and it makes you think a lot about sort of the fitness ramifications of this strategy. I also do a bit of work using stable isotopes. So we have a really awesome stable isotope facility here on campus. And there's some studies that use stable isotopes to identify the breeding or molting origins of populations of birds. So we want to see if we can use stable isotopes to figure out where hybrids are molting, if it's on breeding grounds like an eastern bird, or on these molting grounds in Mexico, like a western bird. I also do a lot of work with museum specimens. So my advisor, Matt Carling, is the curator of the Museum of Vertebrates in the Berry Center, which is a really awesome resource for for lots of things. Again, those of you in ornithology hopefully remember the specimens that we can use for education, but they also have really great value for research. And then really briefly, I think this is the last thing I have. I want to talk about sort of the other main direction of my dissertation. So I have sort of the first part of my research that's focusing on kind of the implications of molts and migration differences for speciation and sort of the trying to reconstruct and predict the future evolutionary history, or the future evolution of these birds, I guess, that hybridize in the Great Plains. But I'm also really interested in what a bird population's molt and migration phenology mean for their future conservation. And the reason why I'm really interested in that is because the North American monsoon, which if you didn't know, is this annual precipitation event that brings a ton of precipitation in many places, over half of the annual precipitation, to parts of Mexico and even in the Southwest United States. And that's why a lot of these Western birds have evolved to time their migration and this extended molt stopover in the Southwest to coincide with this boom in monsoonal productivity. But, unfortunately, you guys are probably all aware that precipitation regimes and a bunch of other things are changing really rapidly throughout the world because of climate change. And unfortunately, the North American monsoon is no exception. So this figure is showing projected changes in the monsoon based on future climate models. And it seems like the monsoon is overall coming, or in the future will come much later now, or much later than it does now. So instead of being like an early or like a summer phenomenon, it will be more of a late fall phenomenon, more precipitation in September and October and less in June and July. And it will also get a lot drier in some areas too. So I want to see if any of these Western molt migrants, here's just some examples of Western bird species that use the monsoon, are already showing signs of being vulnerable to changes in monsoonal precipitation. And this is for a chipping sparrow. Maybe you can't see that icon in the lower right. And unfortunately, it seems like they are. So the monsoon already has been changing quite a bit since historical trends. And it seems like some species are sensitive to the timing of the monsoon. So this chipping sparrow, you can see that their breeding abundance goes up in years where I'm sorry, this is showing total monsoon precipitation. So they're sensitive to total monsoon precipitation. So you can see the breeding abundance of chipping sparrows goes up in years with lots of monsoon precipitation. And they're more likely to show declines in breeding abundance in years that are really dry. And like I was saying, they're also sensitive to changes in the monsoon, or timing changes in the monsoon. So for Lasley buntings, they are more likely to show abundance increases when the monsoon is earlier, and they're more likely to decrease in abundance when the monsoon is later. And that's probably because they're getting to these areas in the usual time, or the time that they have historically, and there's no rain yet. The monsoons haven't come yet. Which could be a big issue for these birds. So it's concerning that the monsoon is overall getting drier and coming later, and it seems like the birds aren't able to adapt to those conditions. But something we're still kind of figuring out. And I guess that's it. Thank you all very much for listening and for inviting me to speak. I hope I didn't make birds seem too boring, because they're really awesome. And I would be happy to take any questions if you guys have them.
I just have one really quick question. Have you guys also been looking at reproductive behavior, I suppose, within these birds, or not?
Yeah, do you mean with the hybrids?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we haven't really looked too much at that, but there have been some studies with the buntings and the other systems of the Great Plains. Um, and for the buntings, there is one study that found that um, uh, indigo or female buntings tend to prefer the song and the plumage of their own species. So there is decently strong mate choice in at least some of these systems. But one thing that's going on with the hybrid zones is that um, hybrid zones usually occur at kind of like the range, like the very outer limits, I guess, of a species distribution. And in those areas, those species are usually pretty rare, at the range limits. So that means like at the hybrid zone, both parental species are pretty rare. So it's harder for these birds to find a mate of their own species. So often we think that, often they just, lower their standards and mate with whatever bunting they can find. Um, but in terms of like the actual reproductive success of individual birds, there was a study with buntings and also one with grosbeaks, looking at hybrids between eastern rose-breasted grosbeaks and western black-headed grosbeaks. And both those studies found that hybrids have smaller clutches. They don't lay as many eggs as unadmixed birds. Um, so what's probably going on is there are just sort of these genetic incompatibilities, sort of like what was going on with the chickadee brains, the hybrid chickadee brains, that cause certain parts of I don't know, like the reproductive systems of these hybrids to not function optimally, I guess. Yeah, or not be as efficient. So there's definitely a lot of potential mechanisms of both prezygotic and postzygotic reproductive isolation in all hybrid zones, probably. And for this one, the molts and migration difference is just one piece of the puzzle. But I think it's really interesting because the climate is changing so rapidly. So the molts, I guess, like selection favoring certain molts and migration phenotypes of both like unadmixed parentals and for hybrids is changing quite a bit. So you could see, we are seeing really rapid changes in the hybrid zone. And I think that part of that is because certain birds, I guess Eastern birds like indigo buntings are expanding their range west. And that could be because Lasley buntings are really struggling now, or could be starting to struggle with changes in the monsoon. Who knows? Who knows? That's what we're trying to figure out. And it's also possible that some hybrid molts and migration behaviors that would have historically been disadvantageous are now neutral or even beneficial. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, a very, very long and rambly answer to your question.
It's all good.
Yeah. Any other questions?
It doesn't quite look like it, but
Cool.
yeah.